Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Julio Godinez, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, Ask Me Anything, Best Practices for Securing Modern Apps with Snyk and Rapid7, brought to you by Snyk. We have a great webinar for you today, but before we get started, I need to go through some housekeeping announcements. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any part of the webinar, this webinar will be available for on-demand viewing. We will be sending out a link to access the webinar on demand, or you can visit devops.com/webinar or securityboulevard.com/webinar, and it will be available there for you as well. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your questions at any time throughout the program by using the Q&A tab. We also encourage discussion by using the chat tab, so let us know your thoughts or just say a quick hello. We do have a handout available, so if you go to the handout section, you'll be able to download it there. We also have polling questions during today's event, so we'd appreciate it if you could take a couple seconds to submit your answers when you see those come up on your screen. Finally, stick around until the end because we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stay tuned to see if you're a winner. Joining me today is Jim Armstrong, Senior Director of Product Marketing, Snyk, and Dan Kirkendall, Senior Director for Application Security, Rapid7. With that, I'm going to turn it over to David Lugo to get started.
Phenomenal. Thanks, Julio. As Julio mentioned, we have a couple of very interesting personas with us today. First of all, we have Dan Kirkendall here from Rapid7. Dan's an industry leader in application security for the past 21 years, with a total of 28 years experience in tech. He was a co-founder and CEO of NT Objectives until acquired by Rapid7 in 2015, and currently serves as Senior Director for Application Security at Rapid7. Then we have Jim Armstrong as well. Jim started his career with McAfee Security Software before moving to virtualization and cloud technologies at VMware. And as developers and new apps started to rule the world, he joined Docker to be part of the container revolution and joined Snyk in 2019. There he leads product marketing for our Snyk container product and heads up the product marketing team for all of Snyk's products now as Senior Director. So thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us. We're going to have a great conversation today about application security. I think the best way, if anything, for us to get started is to get a warm-up question in here. So why don't we get started with, what are some of the recurring DevSec Ops issues or topics that you've seen trending in the industry? And we can jump in here and start with whoever we wanted to. Folks, again, just as Julio mentioned, if you'd like to ask any questions as we go along speaking through these questions, please feel free to put your question in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll answer it as we go along.
Yeah, I guess I'll hop in. One of the things that's been interesting with the DevSec Ops that's kind of been reoccurring, and this kind of goes back over the years, is we're always trying to figure out a place to inject security. And so that's been kind of an ongoing problem, right? And, and this goes all the way back even to network security. Like, when does it fit? When do you do it? And I do like where DevSec Ops is going, because I like the merge with security into the dev team's existing process. I've long been, we had the same issue with most security products having their own security report. And I would, push against that. I mean, we had to have our own security report too for our products, but I always hated that model because a developer is going to get very agitated when you give them a security report. They're going to be very defensive, and you're going to get a lot of pushback. And so a lot of the conversation started being around, okay, well, we need to push our stuff. It's a bug. A bug is a bug is a bug. If we inject it into their bug tracking system, they're a lot less defensive. They're used to bugs. They deal with bugs every day, all day. So I do like that shift left concept and trying to get it closer to the developers. But it's still an ongoing challenge of, where does security fit in the process? Hopefully we get down to where it's all solved in training one day, and every developer that comes through, any kind of formal education would have security built into that. Sadly, that's not the case. But anyway, the reoccurring trend I see is just, when do we inject it? Where does it fit in the process?
Yeah, I think tying into that too, I think even maybe it still happens a bit today. I don't hear it quite as much, but in the last couple of years, there was this notion that developers don't care about security. It's not something we should bother security developers with. They'll never do anything with it. And I think that was more a symptom of things and not the actual truth. I think developers care very much about security. It's just if it's to your point, Dan, I think if it comes late and you're telling them they can't do something and you don't tell them how to fix it and work with them to understand the issue, then yeah, it becomes it's just a blocker. Everything's just a reason to say no to things, and that's probably not the right thing, the right way to do things. So I think that idea that developers don't care about security, I think that started to go away. I think developers do care very, very much about security, but they also care very much about the performance of their application and meeting all these other criteria that they have and delivering the application in general. So it's one of many things that they care about.
Thanks, Jim. And I'm actually going to start a poll because we're interested to see what you all think about what security risks bother you the most or most on your mind as you go along building your DevSec Ops environment in your IT organization. But as we start this poll, I'm wondering, gentlemen, is there something that developers, out of all the security risks that exist, because there are so many and the spectrum is so broad, which of these are ones that maybe developers could be worried about, but they don't have exactly the right visibility to today? The tools don't exist, or maybe it's just that the way security communicates these risks without maybe actionable remediation advice today makes it difficult for developers to deal with, or for the security teams to deal with. Is there something in this modern security world or modern application world that has been particularly difficult to some of the customers that you all have worked with?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a mixture of all these things. I think the tools exist to identify all of the problems here and the number of other problems that we don't have listed here. I think kind of back to, again, maybe what Dan was saying earlier too, the tools exist, but how do we present that information in the right way? How do we present it early enough that we could fix it before it ever, blocks a deployment, right? Or, blocks a pipeline. And how do we identify the right ones to pay attention to? Because even if just looking at this list, there's probably a whole list of issues, right? How do we know which ones are the ones to pay attention to?
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's just one of those categories in a sense. I would kind of even like it because it depends at the moment, right? What's happening. So, if you're asking broadly, let's say malware, okay, yeah, I'm concerned about malware. But if I'm in the middle of a ransomware attack, that becomes my highest priority situation, right? So a lot of it's going to be very context driven and driven by your business and the things that are going to impact your business. And so I think some of it's going to be very context sensitive, but and it is an ongoing challenge. You're saying, with the modern environment, the developers are often getting ahead of the security products. So, as we're looking at the tools that are out there, as Jim said, there's a lot of tools, and we're trying to figure out like where to even present the data, but much less what are the tools for the new environment. So like I look at the misconfiguration. That's a huge one when you're building for the cloud, right? Understanding how things are set up there is a massive problem. As well as the libraries, right? And using these shared libraries, those are because you're dependent on those when you're building some of these, Lambda-based apps or microservice-based apps. You're using these libraries, and so it depends on what you're building with. I think is what you're probably going to be concerned with. So it's a tough one, but they're all important, and it's hard to know which one's important to the person in the moment.
I think you mentioned something interesting there too, which is security is often, I think, trying to catch up to some of these things, like misconfiguration in the cloud. Ideally, Nirvana probably is like, we're going to move to the cloud. We're going to have all these tools to check for misconfigurations before we get there. The reality is a lot of things are already in the cloud. It's already configured. It's already deployed. It's probably misconfigured. Now we have to go back and catch up and now kind of catch up to the fact that it's already happening. Containers were the same way. Virtualization was the same way before that. So I think a lot of these, security is trying to catch back up to where the developers are.
Yeah, and I also think there's often a bit of like bad messaging. So like, I remember, I think it was RSA a few years back when the cloud was kind of becoming a big thing, and everybody's like, the cloud's secure, and there's like they wanted to message that there's good security in the cloud, and for good reason. They're trying to get people past the hurdle, but then they're also giving people a false sense of security in that they think it's already all solved and all dealt with. And I remember my buddy walking around. He's like, "Man, the cloud is so secure. I should move my family there. Like, this is so great." But there's like, it's a whole unknown. Like, it's a big unknown, and we've seen the problems, misconfiguration, and people having open storage locations that just are with random tokens is all that's protecting it. And but the tools weren't there, and now the tools are starting to catch up.
Right.
Yeah.
And folks, just in case you all didn't know, I know you don't have visibility here to the answers of the polls, but it looks like Misconfigurations broke away as the leader here. The majority of you thought that Misconfigurations is probably your biggest area of concern within security in the cloud. Makes perfect sense, especially from what we've heard from Dan and Jim today. Just to keep it moving, we have the next question coming up here, and it kind of works into what we've been talking about, but more of, how do you scale security efforts today with the amount of vulnerabilities coming in, with all of the different attack vectors that you have existing in these very complex, many times ephemeral cloud environments? How do you scale security efforts with today's modern obstacles?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'd love to see, like, if people have thoughts on how they're doing it, I'd love to see people post those in the chat. But I'm always interested in how it's happening in individual cases too. But I think there's an easy answer coming from a vendor, which is like, hey, we have all these great tools, right? But the tools is just one part of it. The people and process is just as important. I think that goes back to the previous question on DevSec Ops. How do you do that effectively, right? How do you get all these different people to work together on the problem, and realize too, it's not just a dev problem or an ops problem. It's all around, right? We want to have full scale visibility into it. So the people and process, I think, is with most things in technology is equally important to the tools and things that you might use as sort of levers there. But I mean, it's a huge part of it. Getting security sort of ingrained in the process and ingrained into people's minds, I think, is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think movements like the DevSec Ops movement and model is definitely a piece of that, because as Jim said, you can have all the tools and rules. I can go to Home Depot and buy every tool and then like park it in my in this plot of land. It's not going to build a house, right? All by itself. You need the people using the tools with skills on how to use the tools and doing them right. That's gonna build your house. And that's where I see the struggle still is, as we get more developers seeing the products working in their DevOps environment. I've been for a long time wanting to get more and more developers involved in the process. And it's hard, right? Product like ours, let's say on the dynamic scanner, the DAS scanner, it's going to tell them problems in their production apps. Tools like Snyk is going to tell them libraries that they're using that are potentially have problems. There's still a gap in being able to tell them, okay, yeah, that library has an issue, but are you using the methods of the library that are actually that have an issue? That's very hard. It becomes very difficult. And so we need to get to a point where the developers aren't being agitated by the tools, but are being informed and helped, and they know how to work with them. So, if you have a security guy come in, you got to fix all these issues and like demanding on them, that's going to create a negative, feedback loop. So it needs to be a lot of like work together with understanding and respect and kind of working through that process. So it's very much the human side of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there's always room for learning more about security. I think we also have to realize that not everybody's going to be a security expert. Like, the developers have security as a thing that they're interested in and want to do better, but that's not their core focus of everything. So they're probably not going to be security experts, at least not on every aspect of their app. So can't assume that knowledge. The same goes for security teams, right? They don't know every aspect of every every app and how the app works and what the code looks like and everything else. So these things have to go together, and I think that's part of that empathy story. Is we need, apps run the business. So I think everybody knows that we need the apps. We need the apps running, but they have to scale. They have to meet all of this needs, but they have to do that in a secure way too. So I don't think it's so much a trade-off. I think early in my career, everything was kind of a trade-off between security and speed, but I don't think people want to make that trade-off. I think people want security and speed, and we have to figure out how to make that happen.
100%. And I think outside of the human aspect too, there's an aspect of automation that we have to consider. These humans that have to be security centric in everything they do, both developers, security teams, DevOps architects, they need the right tooling to be able to automate a lot of the security controls that they implement in development, that they implement in production. But we understand that there are obstacles today to automation through the application lifecycle, even when you require it for ephemeral cloud environments. But from your perspectives, what are the biggest obstacles to automation today? And folks, I'm actually going to post a poll for you all. So we'd like to better understand where is it that you are in your automation journey for your environment as we go along. But gentlemen, if you'd like to jump in here to this question, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
I guess. Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, I think, I think part of it goes back to maybe what we were talking about, which is what's the most important thing to test, right? And that could vary from day to day, based on the last incident that you had to respond to. But I think trying to get up a bigger picture of like, where do you focus your efforts first, and how do you get really good at that, and how do you add other things to that? I think, we asked the question before, misconfiguration sounds like a pretty common concern that loads of people have, and rightly so. There were a good spread of answers there, though, too. So, and a good spread of responses. So it can vary quite a bit. And so I think that comes down to, okay, we picked where we want to focus. We need to automate that, and each one of those might have a slightly different way of automating it. So we want to come up with a repeatable process so that we can scale, so that we can do more of these tests and test all of these different, security. Run all these different security checks and look for all of those things, but they don't always perfectly line up, and they can't all be done like in a 30-second test either. So I think there's a bit of a challenge there, figuring out how best to sort of do that.
Yeah, and I see a lot of ongoing challenges with automation, and so we've been kind of experiencing this for a long time, that automation is challenged more and more as newer technologies are being leveraged, right? So developers are using newer models, newer technologies. So as they make the shift from, a big monolithic web application to, a web app that's got some, it's a single page app kind of model that's got microservices, powering these REST endpoints that the backend is using. Then they start containerizing those things as they keep moving their model. And those are good things from a technology standpoint. They're new and they're getting ahead of the security tools. So automating security in that process becomes very difficult because the tools are still figuring out the problem. And so that, as Jim said, the tools are trying to catch up. That to me is the ongoing challenges. How do you know that your tool is going to match where you're headed? Right? Maybe it'll deal with what you're doing today, but next year, you're shifting over to all containers. Do you have the tools in place? And so that's a big challenge for the automation process, is the tools have to keep up. And as you break these things apart and break down these processes, you're creating these very small automation cycles that have to kind of be built out. And so just keeping up with it is to me a very difficult ongoing challenge.
I'm also interested to hear, we actually have some responses here for our polling. On the first poll, we asked, what aspects of application security have you automated prior to deployment? And it looks like across the board, we got infrastructure as code. Jim, what do you make of those responses?
I mean, I think going back to that, it seems like a lot of people here today are interested or concerned about misconfiguration. So I think that's a That's a good one. I think the whole kind of nirvana of infrastructure as code is you can audit everything. You can see who makes a change. You can test it before it gets rolled out. I think that's the ideal state, and we're not all 100% there yet. There's still loads of changes that get made, outside of the infrastructure as code process, outside of those workflows. So I think it's a good place, though. I think as something that's a little newer, maybe in kind of its adoption cycle, it's a good place to implement, good best practices early, too. So I think that, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to automate that. I guess I'm kind of surprised that some of the others were a little less selected, because I think, in looking at that list, I could realistically see any of those things being automated, and potentially probably should be automated to a large degree. So, but anyway, yeah.
And then we actually had another poll. It was, what aspects of application security have you automated post-deployment? Dan, I'll actually throw this one over to you. It looks like we had a large majority of folks saying penetration testing was what they automated the most. We had web application testing as well, and authentication monitoring. But what do you make of penetration testing being right now, and it almost seems like this has been the case for years and years, penetration testing as the most highly automated in production, at least according to the respondents here?
Yeah, well, and I wonder if they're even, because pen testing is usually a more manual process. So, but I think it's probably they're picking up on the post deployment. What are you doing after you've already the things out? And that is, I think, pretty accurate. Is this, if you're talking about what happens post deployment, it's going to be your pen testing. It's probably going to be your DAS scanning. Those things often, we always encourage our users to do it pre-production, but the vast majority of our scanning is happening on production applications. And the same thing with pen testing. They're usually they're not doing it during the pre-production. And some of that's realistic because it's hard to do it in pre-production because it's a moving target for a human pen tester to be dealing with. And so you kind of have to have somebody in-house, and it's hard to do with like an outside pen tester. So doing it on production kind of makes sense, but then you're also in that situation where once you find out an issue from that pen tester, you're now having to quickly patch a production environment, because you've got this liability sitting out there. So, yeah, I'm not surprised if I remove the automated word out of there and kind of think about what they're doing post deployment, I would say that's probably correct, and kind of lines up with what I've seen.
Yeah, incident response is an interesting one too, because I think obviously it's something you do post deployment. I mean, you can't respond to incidents until after. But I think automating that is something that sounds nice, but also scary. And I think on the pre-production side, right, or the development side too, automated fixes is another one. There are, and Snyk is one of them. There are tools that will supply you code to fix things. It takes a lot of trust to have some machine change your code, though, and just do that automatically, right? And you have to trust your pipelines will test everything and make sure that your application works. So I think there's a high interest in automating some of those things, but there's a lot of trust, that has to come, and testing and thoroughness that has to come to really automate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of things,
I do want to back up to the other poll, the one about the infrastructure as code. I understand why that's a massive concern because, again, it's so new. And IT teams, even when we kind of moved to the cloud and they were kind of spinning up VMs, they kind of understood those as, as servers, kind of, as virtual servers. And they could kind of still wrap their head around this virtualized network because there was still a little more static, right? They would spin up and they would often be long-lived. And so your IT person would kind of normal. And we've been, Rapid7, we've been doing IT, VM, vulnerability management for a long time. And, but as people started moving to the cloud, we started, bringing on other technologies into the company. We have a whole bunch that deal with that, but internally we're having all these conversations all the time where these folks don't know how to deal with the fact that more and more of it's virtualized. Now it's all of your stuff is managed in, let's say, AWS, and all of a sudden now you have another group of people that are building up these Terraform scripts and all this stuff that's going to be spinning up environments, bringing up, you got Kubernetes spinning up multiple containers for a given app, and it's like the complete loss of control of what we thought of as the IT infrastructure, and now they're kind of having to become developers to just manage the IT infrastructure. That's overwhelming for a lot of folks. So I can see why that would be how people would respond if you're coming from that network security space.
Yeah, I think to that point too. I think if when I was at VMware, if somebody wanted a database, a development team needed a database, they had a choice. You could get a small, medium, or large, and it could be SQL Server, or that was it. Those were your choices, and they would figure out how to deploy it for you. If you wanted a clustered version of that, you could make a special request, right? And now you go to AWS, and the database is just there. You just turn it on the service, and off you go. And with Terraform, you can have a database, and you have multiple choices of databases. And tomorrow, AWS will probably have some new database widget that you can use and plug into your app as well. And it's hard to stay on top of all those and figure out what the right configuration is, and are we opening up more security holes? Is our database exposed to the world? Like all those things. It's hard to keep on top of them.
Yeah, you got these in front of AWS. You start using these S3 buckets, and you're just tossing stuff in there, and then oh, well, what's the permissions on these buckets? And
exactly.
It could be a lot.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. We keep touching on this idea of being as thorough as possible, despite the fact that these environments are becoming so complex. It sort of leads us into our next question. A little over a year ago, Gartner wrote a report called 12 Things to Get Right for Successful DevSec Ops. In the report, Dale Gardner gives a piece of advice saying, quit trying to eliminate all vulnerabilities during development. And I think we're hearing some of that from customers and users. But I think the follow-up question is, okay, I know I'm not going to eliminate all vulnerabilities, but where do you all recommend teams focus their time and energy on vulnerability management when they may be using multiple tools with different prioritizing methodologies or different grading of severe, for example? How would you become thorough enough to feel at ease about the applications that you're running into production?
Yeah, it was when I saw that quote, I laughed. I'm like, well, when did we start trying to eliminate all vulnerabilities in development? That's an interesting starting premise, but I do agree that businesses have not, and they're not going to operate on the idea that they're going to wait until all security vulnerabilities are resolved before going into production and moving the business forward. The business is moved forward by product features and the service to the customers, right? And security is one of those things, but it's not the only thing. And too many security folks who think this is so critical and this is the most important thing. No. The most important thing is the company making money, and that's going to drive things. And we need to go help. We need to be there helping them to do that as safe as possible. And so when we're prioritizing, and when I look at the prioritization, I'm trying to look at the impact on the business. What's going to hurt the business the most and making the money? What's going to be impacting the making the money piece of the business? So, it can't be like, oh, this server, if it this vuln on the server means somebody completely could own that server, right? And that's like total ownage is possible on that server. But it's a server that doesn't impact the business. It's off on the side. It's not going to have, okay, fine. They can impact this small little piece of what we do. But if I'm an e-commerce, business, and the app that has an issue with, taking the credit card information has just a small problem, that's much more important than total ownage of this server. So you have to take the practical realities in. It's not just the vuln type, it's impact to the business. And so, there's standards out there like CWSS for applications, which give you a lot of those kind of dials to pick and set what matters to the business. And so that risk rating, I don't think we have it solved at all, but I that's kind of where I lean or I push heavily is what's going to impact the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, thinking about the infrastructure as code example too, there's loads of things like you could come up with a general rule for S3 buckets, but if the S3 bucket is sitting off to the side, it doesn't have access to anything else. And for that matter, there's a firewall, so nobody external could get to it. Well, if the S3 bucket, has full read-write permissions for everybody that's there, but there's only one account that could ever get there, then do you really care? And if it's, it's situational. And I think you have to have that lens on that environment. If it's an S3 bucket that's attached to your web server, right? That's a different thing than if it's an S3 bucket that stores, data that's transactional. There's loads of situational questions that you have to ask. Reachability is another one I think a lot of people like to discuss and talk about, and it's a good way to approach it, but it's a really hard thing to figure out. First of all, in development, we want to look and see, is a vulnerability reachable or not? Well, it's really hard to tell when you're just looking at static code if something's reachable. You can do some traces and kind of try and figure out the path through the code and see if potentially that library might get called. It's a maybe on that one, I think. In a lot of cases, you could try and do that same thing when the app is running, but sometimes it's not easy to see what libraries are being called when the app is running if everything is compiled and and obfuscated. So it's really hard. I think it's a great question. It's a great way of looking at the problem, but reachability, and even reachability is like, it's reachable, but it's never actually reached. Like, so there's different, I think, different ways of looking at it, but I think some of them are really hard to measure too, without tying multiple tools together. And then when you tie multiple tools together, then you have to, a lot of times you have to kind of create that plumbing yourself today too. So.
Thank you both. I think if you have any questions around any of the topics that we've discussed today, please feel free to post them in the Q&A chat. We're going to move on to the next question here. This is about security champions. And I know that not all the organizations out there have started implementing this model, but there's been a discussion for a long time of creating a security champion model, which is of course easier said than done. But maybe Dan, we'll start with you. As a senior director of an engineering team and founder of a company, what tactical examples do you have, or have you implemented at your organization for this idea of a security first model or creation of a security champion? And as you respond, actually, folks, I'm going to put out a poll to see how many of you are implementing this model today in your organizations. We're interested to hear from you.
Yeah, I've been involved in multiple companies and starting NT Objectives. We were a security company coming out of another security company, so we had a lot more awareness organically, right, in the DNA. But even so, we were doing the same thing. We're building the product with features for the customer, especially the user interfaces. So where the user would go in to log in to configure and run their scan. That was being built by a bunch of web developers, right? And so it had a lot of the same problems. And so the idea of security champions, we didn't call it that back then, but we did have at various points in time the developer who would take it upon themselves to, look at the security, right, and kind of dev from the security lens. And that was always helpful. It's a lot to ask from, for a lot of organizations that are trying to like pick or let somebody bubble up as a security champion. That person is only going to impact a certain small area, right? Dev teams are broken up. So if you have a large app, you may have these little 5-person teams, and you're going to have, where does that security champion sit in that process? There is going to be limits if you don't spread the pain a little bit, but if you don't really distribute it out or have a rotating security champion, maybe, quarterly, it's the next person in the line. They're going to now be responsible for learning and kind of looking at their code and their team's work from a security lens. It needs to me, I prefer a rotating model rather than a security champion. It just seems like a lot for one individual. And then they're going to become like a security person who's on the outside trying to poke in and trying to like, hey, can we get, can we talk about this? And they're going to end up on the outside unless it's a rotating role or like a rotating responsibility.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it risks becoming just another security person that's not really part of the team, and I think that's not really the intent of the security champions program. But there's a risk of it becoming that if there's just one person that does it all the time, right? And I've seen a lot of there's the simple examples where I think a lot of organizations will have some sort of internal developer conference or a hackathon or whatever the case might be, where it's a good chance to bring developers together and do something around security and have everybody kind of advance their knowledge together and get some practical examples that people can work on. I know there's a lot of interest in sort of gamification and building some of that training into, we have tools that obviously that will show you vulnerabilities and show you those kinds of things. And it's one thing to have a report that shows you the vulnerability. It's another to have some sort of training kind of built in to that shows you, well, here's, if you want to learn more about this, here's some resources you can use, and kind of build it into your own day-to-day practice as well. I know there's a lot of interest in those kinds of things too. So that, I think those are all efforts to kind of get away from, there's one person who's a security champion, which I think to Dan's point, right, is probably a dangerous thing versus we're trying to get everybody to be better. Not that I think a security champion program is bad. I think the program idea is good, but I think Dan do a security champion solitary is maybe not where we want to go.
Yeah, and I also think it's the other thing that's nice is if you do rotate it or you have more than one or whatever, you because one person will think of like they may jump into it and go like, oh, I want to be the I've learned more about the security stuff. I want to I'm excited about it. They're going to have their initial ideas and stuff that they're going to be like, oh, hey, I just noticed this big issue, and here's this weakness in our model, and they'll kind of glom onto that. They'll go work it, but each person that kind of comes into it and starts thinking about it is going to think about something different, and will come at a different, come at this other area of the code from a different perspective. And we've had that lots of times where, we had back in the day, we would run scans from, let's say the machine would get used multiple times, and found that there was a scenario where while scanning a site, there was the potential for that site to effectively attack the scanner, right? And then that potentially could impact the next scan, right? And maybe there would be some data that could be, extracted or, whatever. We started looking at, hadn't thought about it because we built this and it was working and you had this model that worked and nobody looked at it. And then somebody else comes along and says, hey, what happens if that were to get attacked? Right? Like, well, that's weird, but okay. And so then we're like, okay, solution is we only run that scan once. We use the VM once, run a scan, destroy it, and cleaned it up. It was easy fix, but it took other perspectives coming in to look at, it's hard. That's why people go to counselors, because it's somebody outside looking at their their own self that they have a hard time looking at and having that introspection. So again, having more people involved will often help you get a better result.
It really does take a village. I totally understand. It's a lot of added pressure, it seems, with these modern environments, especially within application security, for example. It could get so complex. The pressure of maintaining that directly from your team or maintaining it in a silo, I think, is a dangerous concept. Sometimes, during the digital transformation, we're witnessing a lot of changes to application development. And like I said, that comes with additional pressure on application security. But when it comes to modern infrastructure, and that could be IAC or it could be containers or serverless workloads, what are some of the biggest challenges that these folks may not be thinking about when, or that they could be facing as their development teams are implementing more modern approaches to security?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the infrastructure as code side of things, and I think there's loads more to talk about there. I think containers is, and to that end, and not just containers, but like serverless and other things that are non-infrastructure, if you want to call them that, I guess. I think the pace of things is probably well understood, right? If you're running your apps in a container, you might get 6 different containers over the course of a day. As a code change is made, a new container is built, and that may never see the light of day in production. It might just be a temporary thing, right? So I think those sorts of things are well understood. I think there's a lot that goes, into containers, so that people are still struggling with, and how do we get to the right kind of container? What is the right kind of container to use? Can we just trust all these containers that are published publicly? Should we be worried about Bitcoin miners and all those things? What is the running footprint of a container, and can somebody get out of those containers, break out and get to the host, and then from the host get access to other things? So the same with Kubernetes. Can they get access to the Kubernetes API and do all kinds of weird and wonderful things in the cluster? Those are all really hard challenges, right? And there's great that they're all open source. I think I've seen some people who go and try and use the open source versions of those things, and some organizations are good with it. Most organizations, I think, struggle when they go that route. I think it's better for most people to kind of take a service version of that, and run with it. But I think I think the pace of it is probably the biggest challenge that I see in trying to stay in front of it, and again, not become an obstacle to it. We know that these things are good in general, because of the pace and because of the things that they can help people do, but they do go along with an increased pace, right? And
Right.
I think that people struggle.
The pace harming, you're saying the ability for them to have full context and full control.
Yeah, I think, so what I see in a lot of cases is people have a pattern where they say, okay, well, yes, we're using containers, but what we've done is we've come up with a list of golden containers, and those are the only ones our developer teams are allowed to use. And it kind of reminds me of the VMware days, where everybody came up with a list of golden images, and those were the only VMs that you were allowed to start with, right? Like we were talking about with the databases. If you want a database, it's great. You have 3 choices: small, medium, and large. And I think with containers, some of that mentality has crept in, where it's like, here's our containers, these are the ones you can use. Well, that's not really it's kind of an anti-pattern. I mean, we want to have some control over the containers. We don't want people to just use anything that they might have found on Docker Hub from some random user. But we also want people to be able to experiment. We want people to be able to test things and prototype and rapidly, develop and create new things, and do things better. So there's got to be some flexibility in it too. But then it comes back to the security question: is that, how much control do we have over it? How can we implement security in the best way so that we check early, we also check after it's deployed, right? So I see that pattern of, we're going to control everything very tightly, kind of coming back. To see the same thing with infrastructure as code too. We're going to use Terraform. We're going to have 5 people that are allowed to write Terraform. Nobody else is allowed to write it. And if you want something new, you have to come to our team and request it. And I don't know that that's really going to work in the long term.
Dan, are you on the same page there?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it. I think one of the things that Jim said, that these things are good things, and I think they are. But I think we also still don't know. there's still a lot of unknown, and I think that there's a lot of teams, including some of ours. We're trying to move to these more modern models because we're presuming that they're going to be better, and they're going to improve things, and they do. They make some things a lot easier and a lot cleaner. I mean, containerization is quite a marvel in the way you can spin up and spin down these containers so quickly, and there's a lot of really good, but you're also having to take development teams that have been building a certain way for a long time, and they're trying to convert in a lot of cases, or switch over to using new technologies that they're not experienced in. So they have a lack of experience and a lack of understanding, and they're trying to make use of these tech stacks. And in a lot of cases, what you already were doing before could be the better model, but you're moving forward because it's more modern. And so there's all of that balance that kind of has to come into play. And then again, making sure the security tools are there, and have to like get comfortable with that you're increasing your supply chain attack model, or risk, right? As you move up, the stuff down below that you have no real control over, like Jim said, did that container have some, Bitminer stuff in there? Like, there are a whole bunch of layers below that you no longer know much about. And, whereas maybe you controlled the whole environment and you were, so which is more secure, which is better? It's a case by case thing. And so teams have to be honestly looking at it and understanding. And my concern is that a lot of teams are going to be coming in, like new teams, right? Younger developers coming in are only going to be building on these new models and completely ignoring the supply chain risks involved and having no historical understanding of what the supply chain risk could be. And so we'll see problems that'll crop up in the years ahead.
Yeah, we ran the report was called the State of Cloud Native App Security Report. It was a survey essentially, and what I found interesting there is the folks who had said we're using more of these modern technologies like containers and infrastructure as code and other sorts of things, also said they had more security incidents than people who didn't. So, if you believe that using containers and infrastructure as code and these new things is going to make you more secure, I think number one, there's a question of what do you mean by more secure? Because you might have more incidents. Now, the flip side of that too was they said they actually fix things faster. I think they have more visibility, and if you're implementing these things with these other security practices, then you potentially have better visibility, and you could potentially fix things faster. So are they more secure? Maybe the answer is yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have fewer incidents. You could have far more incidents, as a matter of fact. And so, I think you have to kind of weigh those things out. I think you also have to, not just adopt these technologies because they're cool and they just go faster. You need to solve problems with them too, right? Because they are going to introduce new challenges, security being one of those, but other challenges as well. And aside from the fact that they can just do things fast, does it actually solve a problem that you have, right? And make your business better. Again, back to Dan's point, like the app is there to serve the business and drive the business forward, and the technology is there to drive the apps. And if it's just cool technology, then maybe evaluate whether it's really worth adopting it or not.
So in this world where we're focused a lot on speed because we want to accelerate time to value for businesses, how do post-production tools fit in? I mean, we talk a lot about tools in pre-production or the build phase of the SDLC, but is there a role for production tools or monitoring tools, for example, in a successful DevSec Ops culture? And Dan, we can actually start with you here if you like.
Sure. Admit I'm a little biased in that we have a defensive product, but I'll counter that. I'll start off with the counterpoint is I definitely don't like teams that will, maybe not prioritize some of the security in the development process and go, okay, we'll just put tools after the fact. We'll put, a WAF or, the next gen WAF, WAF RASP type of product. We're going to put that in place. We're going to have a good IDR process in place. And I example that to being like, okay, let's put my teenager in the car without any formal, without any driving training whatsoever. Just put them in the car and then make sure we rely on that seatbelt to keep them safe. Like, no, you teach, you train, you do work everything you can on the dev process, and then you use those tools as a extra measure that, like, okay, we know that you can't solve it all here and accidents will happen. And that's where you then rely on, the seatbelt and the airbags. And so that's where I try to get teams to focus on, let's solve the security issue. And then let's use these as kind of that extra layer, that extra just in case. And in that, they're great, right? In that, if that's what you're using them for, they can be a powerful tool in the toolbox. Being able to, as Jim was saying earlier, being able to respond quicker, to find out what's going wrong, and be able to react in a more timely fashion. The time to fix thing is one of that stat I track a lot. I watch, White Hat started putting out that report with their time to fix. And, at first it's depressing, but also very realistic. It's way too long. But some of these newer models do make time to fix a lot faster. It's easy to do, a Docker pull, or, just, in the Kubernetes, Terraform, it's just updating the version. Of course, you have all these version conflicts, but that's a whole nother, but sometimes that can make it really quick. If you've got a good RAS product that's showing you where in the code the problem is, it helps the developer get to that area of code faster. So these tools, if they're giving you more information to be able to have a faster time to fix, and while you're doing that, can help protect the application from attack, that's awesome. That's what we should be doing, right? It's that extra measure there. Give the developers time to fix. Again, I don't like it when they'll fix it in the WAF or RAS, and then like, okay, well, it's protected. Like, no, that's just going to take an attacker a little bit more time to figure out their way around the WAF or RASP, and so it should give you time for the developers, but the developers still need to go fix the problems.
Yeah. We use an airplane analogy here. So we talk about, if we're going to get on an airplane and fly somewhere, which I think a lot of us do all the time, or used to, maybe starting to again, hopefully. We want to know that the airplane's put together well. It was good design, and it's securely, engineered, and all the wings are fastened on tight. I also want to have, the assurance of knowing that the pilots have a good in-flight safety system that, is going to help them address problems. They're going to creep up no matter how well the plane is put together, right? We hit turbulence, and I want the plane to take care of itself and still keep flying well, right? I don't want to fly in a plane that doesn't have both of those things. And I think that's kind of the analogy we apply to this. Like, you need to put the app together and put all the Legos together securely. That, all the things that go into your app need to be as secure as possible. But that app, it has to run in production to deliver value to the business, and things change. The production environment is dynamic, and different types of attacks will come in, and you have to be able to respond to those. And you can't just wait for the next development cycle. It has to be something to recognize those and mitigate those and closer to real time. But you have to have both. You can't have only one if you really want to do this right. And to that end too, like, we're talking a lot about the developer side of things. There's loads of services that developers are using, app teams are using, or companies are using that they're not developing themselves. You have to have those tools that can protect those services as well, because you don't have direct control all the time with those, especially if it's somebody else's service that you're consuming. So you still need to have the protection for those things too. So yeah, I think you absolutely have to have both.
Yeah, and actually on that, Jim, I will say also, as you're moving down this process, the vendors of the chain, of the supply chain, right? They need to be a partner. They need to be a partner in the conversation, right? If you're using AWS, it's hard to ask. This is where you as a consumer, customer of these services, you have to be able to feel like you can have a conversation. Sometimes AWS is, they're like, oh no, we're not, like, being able to talk to somebody there is very difficult. And I have a challenge with that. I have a problem with that because they're supplying some core infrastructure, and I need to rely on their security and know that they're doing the right things and not just assume they're doing the right thing. So I think it needs to be partnership across that supply chain. And so, as we're using these tools, and kind of maybe going back to the previous question, that's one of the other problems with this, with some of the modern model, is that supply chain is deep, and they all need to be partners in this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things, speaking of supply chain, that are sort of out there, ideas that are starting to come to fruition around, from on the development side, just this, assurance around which packages are being used. Again, it's less a matter of control, but sort of visibility and knowing, and having that. And I think that it is looking at it again throughout that app lifecycle, and knowing that the app is running, and we did check it in development, so we know what components are in that app and when it's running in production, and we can start to tie those things together. So I think there's some interesting developments coming, around those that are more driven by the community and by open source, which is fantastic. It's great to see that it means that they're being developed by a large number of people with a lot of opinions on how things should be done, which might slow things down a little bit, but I think overall it makes it better. And then for us as vendors, it's great too, because we can kind of see where things are headed, and how we plug into that and plug into the open pieces of this to supply, share information back and forth with all these tools. So I think there's loads of work to do there. We haven't solved it by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely a lot of interesting work.
One other point on this monitoring tools. That's another thing is, again, as a vendor, we need to be doing better, and we need to be working with dev teams a lot better, because there are things sometimes if a developer builds if they do it, they hit a fork in the road. They go, well, we'll try this model on the left, right? That might make it a lot harder for your security product to actually give you good results, right? If you, I don't know, a stupid example, but let's say, we could use JSON, or we could write our own little data format. Well, let's write our own little data format, because we have some things, whatever, we don't want to have to work around JSON limitations or something. Well, that's going to make it dramatically more difficult for your security product to help, analyze the traffic, analyze what's happening, because it can't understand the data structures. But if you use JSON, maybe it makes it easier, right? If you're building out and you have logging for everything, and it's easy to hook in the logging for an IDR product to be able to see, when users log in or whatever. As you're building out, if you understand what the security tools need and you build with that in mind, that can often help you make better use of the defensive products as well. So, and I don't think very many developers think about that. It's kind of the last thing they're thinking about. But if, sometimes a very small choice can help you from making it, making the security product a better tool, or a less effective tool. And it may not really take much of your dev time at all to work in the model that could serve the security product. So that's another thing. I've worked with teams and kind of like we had a big software company. Every API, they started building out more and more APIs, and so eventually we said, you know what? It's very hard for us to scan APIs, but if you can give us a Swagger document or an Open API doc, then we could do more. So they started going through on all their dev teams and saying, every API you build, you have to publish your Swagger Open API doc. That actually helped them, because now they all internally had good documentation, and it served the security product. But you need that partnership, right? You need the teams to all be working together, and so kind of working with your vendors on the security side and knowing what helps their tools work better can help you build very, very little effort and improve security dramatically.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point. And for the same reason, we have such a close partnership today between Snyk and Rapid7. We work very closely together, folks, to provide your development teams with the ability to secure critical components of your cloud-native application development lifecycle. This is an end-to-end application security approach that includes software composition analysis, static and dynamic testing, and RAFs to make sure that you're building securely and that you're secure in production. If you'd like to learn more or reach out to one of our experts on either side, visit rapid7.com or snyk.io. We'd be happy to sit down with you and work out a plan for you to have a holistic approach to your application security within your IT organization. But as we finish it off, I want to thank Jim and Dan one more time for joining us. That was an excellent conversation that we had around application security. Hope to have you both back soon. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Julio. Thanks again, everyone, for coming.
Excellent. Just as a reminder that today's webinar has been recorded, so if you miss any or all of the webinar, you will be able to watch it again. We will be sending an email with a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar will also be available on devops.com and securityboulevard.com. Just look in the on-demand section in the webinars page, and it should be there. Our 4 Amazon gift card winners for today are Tiffany D. Congratulations. Richard W., Alexandra B., and Vince B. So congratulations to all our winners. We'll be reaching out to you via email with instructions for claiming your Amazon gift card. So please check your inbox. And if you don't see it there, check your spam folder. Jim, Dan, and David, thank you very much for that excellent conversation. I'd also like to thank the audience for their time and engagement. This is Julio Godinez signing off until next time. Be well.